The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Guardsman James Mitchell adjusted his iconic red tunic for what felt like the 100th time that day. Standing at attention outside the palace gates, he maintained the stoic expression that had become second nature during his 3 years of service. Tourists gathered nearby, cameras clicking constantly, hoping to catch even the slightest reaction from the famously unmoving sentries. What the crowd didn't know was that behind James's stern facade, his mind was wandering to his daughter's upcoming birthday party. She had specifically requested that he wear his funny hat, referring to his bearskin cap, to the celebration. The thought made the corners of his mouth twitch, though years of training kept his expression neutral. A small commotion near the fence caught his attention. A young boy, probably around 7 years old, had somehow slipped away from his family and was now pressed against the palace railings, his face squished between the metal bars as he stared at James with wide, curious eyes. The child's enthusiasm was infectious, and James could see the pure wonder in the boy's gaze as he took in every detail of the red uniform and towering bearskin hat. The boy's mother appeared moments later, slightly out of breath and clearly embarrassed. She began apologizing profusely while trying to gently pull her son away from the fence. But the child wasn't budging. Instead, he had begun a one-sided conversation with James, explaining in great detail about his toy soldiers at home and how they looked almost exactly like the Real Guard standing before him. James remained perfectly still, but inside his heart was warming. The boy reminded him so much of his own daughter at that age, fearless, curious, and completely unaware of social boundaries. The child continued his animated chatter, describing how he had lined up all his toy guards in formation in his bedroom, and how he practiced marching like them every morning before school. As the mother continued her gentle attempts to retrieve her son, something unexpected happened. A slight breeze picked up, and James's bearskin cap shifted slightly. Without thinking, he reached up to adjust it, a completely natural, human gesture that broke the illusion of him being a statue. The boy's eyes widened even further, if that was possible, and he let out a delighted gasp. "Mummy, he moved? He's real!" the child exclaimed, practically vibrating with excitement. For a brief moment, James allowed himself the smallest of smiles. It was barely perceptible, lasting only a few seconds, but the boy caught it immediately. The child's face lit up like Christmas morning, and he pressed his face even harder against the railings, grinning from ear to ear. The mother, who had been watching this gentle exchange, stopped her attempts to pull her son away. She seemed to understand that something special was happening. Instead, she quietly stepped back and watched as her son and the guard shared this moment of human connection across the formal barriers of duty and protocol. James knew he was walking a fine line. Royal Guard were trained to remain impassive under all circumstances, but there was something about this child's genuine enthusiasm that reminded him why he loved his job in the first place. It wasn't just about ceremony and tradition. It was about representing something bigger than himself, something that could inspire wonder and pride in people of all ages. The boy began asking questions, even though he didn't expect answers. "Do you live in the palace? Do you know the Queen? Is that hat heavy? Do your feet hurt from standing so long?" Each question was delivered with the earnest curiosity that only children possess, and James found himself wanting to answer every single one. After several minutes, other tourists began to notice the interaction. They gathered around, cameras ready, hoping to witness more of this rare moment of humanity from the usually stoic guard. But James was careful. He maintained his position and composure while still acknowledging the boy's presence with the occasional gentle eye contact. Eventually, the boy's father appeared, having finally located his missing family members. He began to apologize as well, but James gave him the same subtle nod he had given the boy, a small gesture that conveyed understanding and warmth without breaking protocol. As the family finally moved on, the boy waved enthusiastically at James, calling out, "Goodbye, soldier." His pure joy was contagious, and several nearby tourists found themselves smiling at the interaction they had just witnessed. James returned to his focused stance, but something had changed. The remainder of his shift felt lighter, and every time a child looked his way with wonder, he remembered the boy at the fence and the reminder that beneath the uniform, ceremony, and tradition, there was still room for simple human kindness. The afternoon shift change at Windsor Castle always brought a moment of relief for Guardsman Sarah Chun. As she walked toward the guardhouse after completing her 2-hour post, she could feel the familiar ache in her shoulders from maintaining perfect posture under the weight of her bearskin cap. The summer heat had been particularly intense today, and sweat had pooled beneath her heavy red tunic despite her years of conditioning. Inside the guardhouse, a small group of off-duty guards had gathered around a table, engaged in what had become their daily ritual, a competitive card game that had been running for weeks. The winner of each day got first choice of the evening meal, a prize that had taken on almost legendary status among the unit. Sarah kicked off her heavy black boots and wiggled her toes with visible relief. The other guards looked up from their game with knowing grins. Everyone understood the particular torture that came with standing motionless in formal dress for hours at a time, especially during the busy tourist season when visitors seemed to multiply by the hour. "Rough crowd today?" asked Guardsman Thompson, shuffling the cards with practiced ease. "3 marriage proposals, 2 people trying to make me laugh by doing silly dances, and 1 gentleman who spent 20 minutes explaining why I should smile more," Sarah replied, settling into an empty chair with a dramatic sigh. "Oh, and a woman asked if she could try on my hat because it would look great with her outfit." The table erupted in laughter. These stories had become commonplace, but they never lost their entertainment value. Each guard had accumulated a collection of unusual tourist encounters that ranged from amusing to completely bizarre. Thompson dealt Sarah into the game just as Guardsman Williams entered, still in full uniform but looking slightly frazzled. His usually immaculate appearance showed small signs of wear, a barely noticeable wrinkle in his tunic and a slight dishevelment to his white gloves. "Let me guess," said Sarah. "Someone tried to get a reaction again?" Williams nodded, but his expression was more amused than annoyed. Actually, it was quite sweet. There was this elderly gentleman in a wheelchair, must have been a veteran based on his posture and the way he carried himself. His granddaughter was pushing him around, giving him a tour of the grounds. He paused to remove his bearskin cap, running his hand through his hair in relief. The others waited, knowing from his expression that there was more to the story. The man stopped right in front of my post and just studied me for the longest time. Not in a challenging way, more like he was remembering something. His granddaughter seemed a bit embarrassed and tried to move him along, but he held up his hand to stop her. William sat down and accepted the cards Thompson dealt him. Then he did something I've never experienced before. He sat up as straight as he could in his wheelchair and gave me the most perfect military salute I've ever seen. His form was flawless, despite his age and condition. You could tell he had been a soldier once. The room had grown quiet. Military respect was something all the guards understood deeply, and the image Williams painted resonated with each of them. "What did you do?" asked Chin softly. "Well, I wasn't supposed to do anything, obviously. But there was something in his eyes, this look of mutual understanding between soldiers, you know? So I waited until no one else was watching, and I gave him the slightest nod I could manage. Nothing that would get me in trouble, but enough that he would know I acknowledged his respect." Williams smiled at the memory. The old man's face just lit up. His granddaughter saw what happened too, and she mouthed thank you to me before they moved on. Turns out she had been trying to get him interested in outings for months since her grandmother passed away. This was the first time she'd seen him truly engaged with anything. The card game continued, but the mood had shifted to something warmer. These moments reminded all of them why their role mattered beyond the ceremony and tourism. They were part of a living tradition that connected past and present, honoring those who had served before while inspiring future generations. Thompson shared his own story from the previous week about a young girl who had been visiting with her class on a school trip. She had noticed that one of the horses seemed restless during the changing of the guard ceremony, and had asked her teacher if the animals ever got tired or scared by all the attention. The teacher didn't really have a good answer, Thompson continued, but the girl kept watching the horses instead of focusing on us guards. She seemed genuinely concerned about their welfare. During a brief moment when I was walking to my next position, I made sure to give that particular horse a gentle pat. The girl saw it and smiled so big that her whole class turned to look at her. These stories served as reminders that their job was about much more than standing still and looking impressive. Every day, they had the opportunity to create positive memories for visitors from around the world. Whether it was a child's first glimpse of royal tradition, a veteran's moment of recognition, or simply providing a sense of stability and continuity in an ever-changing world, their role carried weight beyond the obvious. As the afternoon card game wrapped up and the guards prepared for evening duties, each of them carried with them the renewed understanding that even the smallest human gestures could have profound impacts. Tomorrow would bring new tourists, new challenges, and new opportunities to represent the best of their tradition while remaining connected to their humanity. The late evening rain had driven most tourists away from the grounds of the Tower of London, leaving Yeoman Warder David Russell with a rare moment of quiet during what was usually a bustling shift. Standing under the stone archway, he watched the raindrops create small rivers across the ancient cobblestones, reflecting the warm glow of the historic lanterns that lined the pathways. At 52, Russell had served as a beefeater for nearly 8 years, following a distinguished military career that had taken him across 3 continents. He had grown accustomed to the weight of his elaborate Tudor-style uniform and the constant attention from visitors eager to hear tales of the tower's bloody history. But tonight, with the grounds nearly empty, he found himself appreciating the peaceful atmosphere that rarely existed during daylight hours. A movement near the White Tower caught his attention. A small tabby cat emerged from behind one of the ancient stone buildings, shaking rainwater from its fur with obvious displeasure. Russell recognized the animal immediately. It was one of several strays that had somehow made the tower grounds their home, much to the unofficial delight of the staff. The cat approached cautiously, as if weighing its options in the continuing drizzle. Russell had always been fond of animals, and during quieter moments over the past few months, he had developed a friendly relationship with this particular feline visitor. He reached into his pocket and retrieved a small piece of a sandwich he had saved from lunch, carefully breaking it into cat-appropriate pieces. "Come on then, Winston," he called softly, using the nickname he had given the cat after noticing its particularly dignified bearing and stubborn personality. "Let's get you out of this weather." Winston approached with the cautious confidence of a cat who had learned to trust this particular human. Russell guided the animal toward a dry alcove where some old wooden crates provided shelter from the rain. As Winston settled down to enjoy his unexpected meal, Russell found himself relaxing in a way that rarely happened during his official duties. The quiet moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps echoing off the wet stones. Russell straightened slightly, preparing to return to his formal demeanor, but relaxed when he recognized his colleague, Yeoman Warder Margaret Foster, making her rounds with a large umbrella. "Feeding the strays again, David?" she asked with a knowing smile, joining him in the shelter of the archway. "Just being neighborly," Russell replied, watching Winston methodically work through the sandwich pieces. "Besides, he's better company than most of the tourists who ask me the same 5 questions every day." Margaret laughed quietly. At 60, she was one of the first female yeoman warders in the tower's long history, having broken barriers when women were finally allowed to join the ranks in 2007. Her presence had initially caused quite a stir among traditionalists, but her extensive military background and natural storytelling ability had quickly won over both colleagues and visitors. "I had an interesting encounter today," Margaret said, settling onto one of the wooden crates while keeping her umbrella positioned to protect them both from the rain. "A young woman approached me during the afternoon tour. Turned out she was a history student writing her dissertation on women's roles in military history." Russell nodded, encouraging her to continue while Winston moved closer to them, apparently enjoying the warmth of human companionship along with his meal. She was particularly interested in how it felt to be part of changing such an ancient tradition. "Usually, I give visitors the standard information about her selection process and requirements, but something about her genuine curiosity made me open up a bit more. Margaret paused, watching the rain create patterns on the cobblestones. I told her about my first day here, how nervous I was about representing something so historically significant, how the weight of the uniform felt like carrying centuries of tradition, but also how important it was to me to prove that respect for tradition and progress could coexist. Russell had heard similar sentiments from Margaret before, but he never tired of her perspective on the changes she had witnessed and helped create. Her journey from breaking barriers to becoming a respected and beloved part of the tower's character inspired him regularly. What struck me most, Margaret continued, was her follow-up question. She asked if I ever felt lonely being one of so few women in this role, or if the historical weight ever felt overwhelming. Winston had finished his meal and had somehow positioned himself between the two warders, purring contentedly as the rain continued to fall around their sheltered alcove. I realized as I was answering that I don't feel alone at all anymore. This place, these traditions, this brotherhood, and now sisterhood of people dedicated to preserving history while making it accessible to the public, it's become home in a way I never expected. Russell understood exactly what she meant. The Tower of London wasn't just their workplace. It was a living piece of history that they were privileged to protect and share. Every day brought opportunities to connect the past with the present, whether through formal tours or quiet moments like this one. Speaking of unexpected connections, Russell said, gently stroking Winston's head, this little fellow has taught me something about finding comfort in the most unlikely places. Here's a stray cat who has somehow made one of England's most famous fortresses into his personal kingdom. As if understanding that he was the subject of conversation, Winston looked up at both warders with the satisfied expression of a creature who had found exactly where he belonged. The rain began to lighten, and both warders knew their moment of quiet companionship would soon end as evening duties called. But, for now, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the ancient stones glisten with rainwater while sharing space with a contented cat who had somehow become an unofficial resident of one of the world's most famous historical sites. The morning mist hung low over the grounds of Edinburgh Castle as Guardsman Connor MacLeod prepared for what promised to be one of the busiest days of the tourist season. The annual Edinburgh Festival was in full swing, bringing thousands of additional visitors to the ancient fortress perched high above the Scottish capital. Connor had been stationed here for 2 years, but the combination of festival crowds and international tourists still presented daily challenges that kept him on his toes. As he adjusted his red tunic and checked his equipment one final time, Connor caught sight of himself in the reflection of a nearby window. At 24, he was one of the younger guards in his unit, but his dedication to the role had earned him respect from both his colleagues and superiors. Growing up in a small Highland village, he had never imagined he would one day be responsible for maintaining the dignity and security of one of Scotland's most important historical sites. The first tour group of the day was already gathering near the entrance, led by an enthusiastic guide who was clearly preparing to launch into the standard historical presentation. Connor took his position near the Crown Jewels exhibition, knowing from experience that this area would see heavy traffic throughout the day. What he didn't expect was the composition of the morning's first visitors. A group of elderly residents from a local care home had arrived for a special guided tour, many of them using wheelchairs or walking aids. Their faces showed a mixture of excitement and nostalgic recognition as they slowly made their way through the castle grounds. One woman in particular caught Connor's attention. She appeared to be in her 80s, with silver hair neatly styled and bright blue eyes that seemed to take in every detail of her surroundings. Unlike many visitors who focused primarily on taking photographs, she was clearly absorbing the experience with all her senses, touching the ancient stone walls, breathing in the morning air, and listening intently to every word of the guide's presentation. As the group paused near Connor's position, the elderly woman separated slightly from the others, moving closer to examine the details of his uniform. She studied the insignia, the precise arrangement of his equipment, and the careful maintenance of every element of his appearance with the attention of someone who understood military standards. "My late husband would have appreciated seeing this," she said quietly, speaking directly to Connor despite knowing he wouldn't respond while on duty. He served in the Scots Guards during the war. Always said there was nothing more important than taking pride in representing something bigger than yourself. Connor maintained his disciplined stance, but her words resonated deeply. His own grandfather had served in the same regiment decades earlier, and family stories about military service had been part of his inspiration for joining the Guard. The woman continued speaking, seemingly comfortable with the one-sided conversation. "He used to tell me that the hardest part of military service wasn't the physical demands or even the danger. It was learning to balance the need for absolute discipline with remembering that you're still human underneath the uniform." She paused, studying Connor's face with the perceptive gaze of someone who had spent many years reading people. "He would have said you're doing that balance justice, young man. There's strength in your posture, but kindness in your eyes." Connor felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words. Compliments from tourists were common enough, but this felt different, like recognition from someone who truly understood what the role meant and required. The care home group began to move toward the next part of their tour, but the elderly woman lingered for just a moment longer. She reached in her handbag and retrieved a small object, glancing around to ensure she wasn't being observed by other tourists or staff. "This belonged to my husband," she whispered, holding up a small military pin, the kind of regimental badge that soldiers treasured as symbols of their service and brotherhood. "I've carried it with me for 20 years since he passed. I think he would have wanted someone like you to have it." She placed the pin carefully on the stone ledge beside Connor's position, in a spot where it would be visible to him, but not obvious to casual observers. The gesture was both deeply personal and respectful of the formal boundaries that govern his role. "Thank you for your service," she added softly before rejoining her group. Connor watched her walk away, feeling profoundly moved by the unexpected encounter. The pin sat on the ledge like a small beacon, representing connections across generations of service members and the families who supported them. He would have to wait until his shift ended to properly examine the gift, but its presence served as a constant reminder throughout the rest of the morning that his role carried meaning far beyond ceremony and tradition. Later that day, when Connor finally had the opportunity to examine the pin closely, he discovered it bore the insignia of the Scots Guard along with a small engraving on the back. "For honor and duty, James Morrison, 1943 to 2021. The discovery added new depth to his understanding of the woman's gesture. She had chosen to share not just a piece of military history, but a tangible connection to her late husband's service and sacrifice. The pin would become one of Connor's most treasured possessions, serving as a daily reminder of the continuum of service that connected him to generations of soldiers who had worn the uniform before him. That evening, as he prepared to end his shift, Connor reflected on how a simple moment of human connection had transformed what might have been just another busy day into something much more meaningful. The elderly woman had reminded him that behind every uniform was a person with hopes, dreams, and connections to others, and that honoring tradition meant remembering the human stories that gave those traditions their true power. The first snowfall of winter had transformed the grounds of Kensington Palace into something resembling a Victorian Christmas card. Guardsman Emily Watson found herself grateful for the thermal undergarments beneath her red tunic as she took her position for the afternoon shift. The snow continued to fall in gentle flakes, creating a magical atmosphere that seemed to enchant the smaller crowd of hardy tourists who had braved the cold weather. At 26, Emily had been serving as a Royal Guard for 3 years, following in the footsteps of her father who had held the same role during the 1990s. She often thought about the stories he had shared of his own service, particularly his advice about finding moments of joy and human connection even within the strict confines of duty and protocol. Today would prove to be one of those days he had described. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor, a young girl, probably around 8 years old, who had become separated from her family group during their tour of the palace gardens. Emily first noticed her standing alone near the memorial fountain, looking around with growing anxiety as she realized she didn't recognize any of the faces in the nearby crowd. The child's distress was evident, but Emily faced a dilemma. Her position required her to remain at her assigned post, but her instincts as both a protector and a human being urged her to help the lost child. She watched carefully as the girl began to cry, small tears freezing on her cheeks in the cold air. Emily made a decision that balanced her duty with compassion. She remained in position, but began making subtle gestures to attract the attention of other palace staff who might be able to assist. She caught the eye of a nearby security officer and used minimal head movements to indicate the child's location and apparent situation. While waiting for help to arrive, Emily did something that would have warmed her father's heart. She began making very slight facial expressions, just small changes that wouldn't be obvious to most observers, but were clearly visible to the distressed child. A gentle softening around her eyes, the barely perceptible curve of an encouraging smile, tiny nods that communicated safety and reassurance. The girl noticed these subtle signals immediately. Children, Emily had learned, were often more perceptive than adults when it came to reading human emotions and intentions. The child stopped crying and took a few tentative steps closer to Emily's position, finding comfort in the quiet strength and kindness she saw in the guard's expression. Within minutes, palace staff had located the child's frantic parents, who had been searching the grounds in growing panic. The reunion was emotional, with tears of relief from both parents and renewed smiles from their daughter. But before rejoining her family, the little girl did something that touched everyone who witnessed it. She approached Emily's position and, with the solemnity of someone much older, offered a small salute that she had obviously learned from watching military ceremonies on television. Her form was imperfect, but her intention was clear. She wanted to show respect and gratitude to the guard who had provided comfort during a frightening moment. Emily, maintaining her disciplined stance, acknowledged the gesture with the slightest bow of her head. It was a minimal response by any measure, but it communicated volumes about mutual respect, kindness, and the human connections that could exist even within the most formal circumstances. The child's parents, understanding what had transpired, approached Emily's position with their daughter. They spoke quietly, expressing their gratitude not just for the girl's safety, but for the compassion their daughter had received during her moment of fear. They had witnessed Emily's subtle communications with their child and recognized the skill and caring it had taken to provide comfort without abandoning her duties. As the family prepared to leave, the father shared something that would stay with Emily for years to come. He explained that their daughter had been talking about becoming a soldier when she grew up, inspired by seeing female guards during their palace visits. Today's experience, he said, had shown her that strength and kindness were not opposing qualities but could exist together in the same person. The snow continued to fall as Emily completed her shift, but she felt warmed by the reminder that her role extended far beyond ceremony and tradition. Every day brought opportunities to represent the best qualities of service, protection, dignity, compassion, and strength. The little girl's salute had been a recognition not just of Emily's uniform, but of the person wearing it. Later that evening, as Emily shared the day's events with her colleagues in the guard quarters, she realized how these moments of human connection had become the most meaningful part of her service. The formal ceremonies, the precise movements, the unwavering discipline, all of these elements were important, but they gained their true significance when they served to protect, comfort, and inspire the people who looked to them for security and continuity. Her father had been right about finding joy within duty. The real privilege of wearing the uniform wasn't just in upholding tradition, but in the daily opportunities to make a positive difference in people's lives, even through the smallest gestures of kindness and understanding. As snow continued to blanket the palace grounds, Emily reflected on how each day brought new reminders that behind every uniform was a person committed to serving something greater than themselves, while never forgetting the human connections that made that service meaningful. The little girl's salute had been a perfect symbol of how respect, gratitude, and compassion could bridge any gap between duty and humanity.